All right, hello, and welcome to another episode of my live podcast, Heal Through Humor. Today, I am having a chat with my colleague and friend, Ken Reed. He is a counselor in Australia, and we will be discussing the differences between an actual diagnosis and what we look for in that, clinically speaking, versus somebody having traits of what is widely talked about on Instagram and all over social media, which is narcissism as a disorder versus a narcissistic personality trait. So we will get Ken in here, and for the podcast specifically, I'm going to see if Instagram will let this work. Let's see. Hello.
Good morning. How are you going?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Really good. I'm feeling fresh to talk about all things narcissism, which is like the hot button topic of the internet. I mean, obviously, I'm a narcissist. You're a narcissist. We're all narcissists.
And everything is a trauma response. So let's not get that twisted.
You know, I woke up this morning, and when I got your message that you needed food, I was people pleasing in an anxious, attached state, thinking to myself, oh my God, she's going to hate me if I acquiesce and, say, no, you can't have breakfast. So I let her have breakfast. That is my trauma response playing out hardcore right now.
Yes. If you can't tell, we will be able to be using humor today. For this specific episode, I am not going to keep an eye on the comments. So if you are messaging in anything, I'm not going to get distracted by what we're talking about today. Being single focused is the more important part because I want to actually get good quality information out there. It's not to count anybody's questions, but that is not the point of the podcast right now. At least it's to be able to explain why this is such a hot button topic, as well as delineating between a clinical presentation of it, which can truly only be done by a trained health professional, versus diagnosing your ex or that you don't like because they're full of themselves. So with that said, I will not be looking at the comments, and if you chat one in, it's going to go into the ethers and we will get started. So the main topic that I wanted to focus on before we dive in, I want you to introduce yourself and more about your work, but the main topic we're going to focus on today is truly delineating like the actual diagnostic criteria versus when we have traits. And spoiler alert, everybody has narcissistic traits. It's how well they're integrated or not that delineates what it looks like in your life. So before we take it away, Ken, go ahead and introduce yourself and what it's like to be a counselor in Australia. Because we are here, I'm in America, you're in a different country, so.
Very true. So hello everyone, my name is Ken. I am a counselor, formerly doing a lot of different kinds of coaching, and I am really settling into this role off the back of my counseling training and also from the coaching work that I did, really trying to help people who are feeling like they're at rock bottom, to help them, rebuild themselves and get them on place where they're living in a life that's in alignment for them according to their values and also to a belief system that really empowers and works for them. I guess this is something that I did talk to you about and does relate to today's topic, which is, as a counselor, I actually can't diagnose. However, I know that's different for different parts of the world. As counselors, we really just take people as they are and just listen to them and really just have the opportunity to hold space. And I think when it does come to this topic, though, it's still relevant because even though I don't have the ability to diagnose, I still have to recognize patterns of behavior. And at times when people have come to me and said, I had a really difficult time with this person I was with, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it may be, if the patterns do start to speak for themselves, I'm like, that sounds narcissistic. And I have got no shame in calling out the behavior, because even if there is a lot of evidence for the behavior, sometimes that can be enough for the person to have a bit of reality about, say, if it's back to the breakup, so it wasn't all me feeling confused or gaslit was a consequence of me being in this kind of environment. So, but I think here's the rub, and I think this is where this will nicely lead into the start of this conversation, is I think it's very easy to get bogged down holding on to the diagnostic label and to be like, oh, they've got NPD. And that's where I think we're getting stuck. And I think that the last thing I'll say before I throw this over to you, Talia, is I think there is a lot of wisdom out on the internet now and maybe too much information about narcissism to the point where I think we're just labeling everyone a narcissist and not actually getting to the core of the matter.
Mhm. Yes. So this is where I can come in. I am trained clinically to diagnose. This is not me giving a diagnosis to anyone. Very, very clear that this is based on sharing factual data and what we would look for if somebody were to come into our office and say, hey, or seek treatment, right? So I'm going to read because I have my notes pulled up so I can be very organized. The first piece of this is delineating adaptive narcissism versus maladaptive narcissism. And adaptive narcissism refers to traits that can be actually helpful, like if you have self-confidence, self-reliance, and the ability to set boundaries and celebrate yourself. So that is an adaptive form of being interested in oneself and caring for oneself. It does not mean that you're obsessed with yourself, and it does not border into it being pathological or hurting another person. Again, every human is born with this tendency or ability. It is how well it is integrated or not that can potentially turn into a disorder. Maladaptive narcissism is connected to traits that do not serve you and impact how you relate to yourself and others. This like entitlement, aggression, and a tendency to take advantage of others. This is more typical and would be associated with what we commonly see in the office of narcissistic personality disorder. So again, everybody has the traits. It's how well they're integrated or not. Simply liking how you look one day or putting yourself above somebody else, occasionally does not make one a narcissist. We see this be long-standing over the duration of a patient's life. We see this typically present in multiple areas of their life. And if we were to gather most everybody they knew in a room, we may see some congruency with the person's experience of the person that we're discussing or the identified patient in that case. So with that as the groundwork, there's the delineation, right? It can be an adaptive personality trait to be a self-reliant, to be, full of ourselves a little bit if we're trying to give ourselves an ego boost. That does not make one a narcissist. So very clear delineation on that. Do you have any comments before I go into the actual DSM diagnostic criteria?
Yes, I suppose the one thing I'll say, which is still a very useful thing that I think is being shouted out by those that are helpful in this community, is before we dive into the diagnosis, this is not your excuse to hold on to that diagnosis or use it to apply it to anyone. It is merely just it's merely just a bit of extra information, a bit of, something to know that's useful and relevant. It is not a opportunity to be like, this person is a narcissist.
Yeah, if you don't have, and I say this with being able to free people from what often happens, it's not your job, even if it is your clinical training to do so, it is not your job unless the person's coming in and wanting help to give somebody else a diagnosis. So to free yourself from that, not what you need to be doing, especially if you're not in it. It gets around a lot, and social media has popularized it. So per an actual diagnostic and statistic manual, which is what we typically diagnose from, especially if you're going the insurance route, which is a whole other topic, read exactly what the traits are, and then you can talk about afterwards how some people could be like, oh wait, I do that sometimes, because again, it's different. So it is a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, fantasy, or actual behavior, a need for admiration with a lack of empathy beginning by early adulthood, as indicated by at least 5 of the following. Having a grandiose sense of self-importance, for example, exaggerating achievements, expecting to be recognized as superior without actually completing the achievements, is preoccupied with fantasies of success, power, brilliance, beauty, or a perfect love, believes that they are special and can only be understood by or should only associate with other special people or institutions or kind of groups, different groups, requiring excessive admiration, having a sense of entitlement, such as an unrealistic expectation of favorable treatment or compliance with his or her expectations, is exploitative and takes advantage of others to achieve their own ends, no matter the means. I added that last part on there. Lacks empathy and is unwilling to identify with the needs of others, is envious of others or believes that others are envious of them. Lastly, showing arrogant, haughty, not like haughty, but like HAUGHTY behavior attitudes. The diagnosis as a personality disorder requires evaluation of long-term patterns of functioning. One needs to be cautious not to jump to hasty conclusions because NPD can trigger countertransferences. A careful evaluation of the different aspects of a person's life and an understanding of their childhood development can assist in the evaluation and the diagnosis. So that is the clinical down low from a mental health professional. That is what, if somebody came into our office, we would look for. The piece about personality disorders, though, as we're trained to understand, is that some diagnoses and some experiences of mental health conditions are what are called ego syntonic, meaning they are, like the word synonymous, they feel congruent with who the person is as a self. And it's typically people around that person who are experiencing some of the maladaptions or some of the stress or kind of the spillover of those traits or of that diagnosis. And personality disorders are typically considered that. Borderline is an exception because it is really difficult to have that as a disorder if it goes untreated. So there is a difference there. That one can be a little bit more like, I see something's wrong. I don't know what's going on with me. I kind of know it's me, but for the other personality disorders, they're typically egosyntonic, meaning the person is less likely to refer themselves to treatment. It's typically other people around them reporting going on, or they're giving ultimatums like, you need to fix this unless, if you want to stay in the relationship. And other personality or other disorders that aren't personality disorders or other diagnoses or concerns that we look for, like anxiety, depression, any sort of other commonly heard about diagnosis, those are usually ego dystonic. They don't fit well. They feel very uncomfortable, and the person's motivated to change them because anxiety and depression and other diagnoses, even health diagnoses, can be very debilitating. So that's another important note that I want to put out there, that the likelihood of somebody referring themselves to get treated for this specifically would be low by definition of all of the traits, because if a person is this and truly believes this about themselves, they typically don't think something's wrong with them or what they're doing, and so they wouldn't go to therapy to fix it. So I wanted to make a note of that as well.
Which I think does nicely link up with the fact that whilst there are maybe 1 to 3% of diagnosed narcissists worldwide, it's not an accurate representation of the population of people who are struggling genuinely with NPD. And it also doesn't take into account people who may be going through a very particularly narcissistic phase in their life. And this is the key thing that I want to say very, very carefully, because I want to make this abundantly clear. People with NPD cannot change. That's just the way it is. However, people who may have a narcissistic side that's playing out at a particular moment in time have the ability to grow and to unlearn some of that when they realize, oh shit, this behavior of mine is perhaps ruining my relationships, my life, my belief in myself. I feel low self-esteem. But I want to be very clear. Real change takes a damn long time.
Yeah.
And I speak from my own experience. I had a very narcissistic phase much younger when I was a child, and by that I mean not as a child, as a young adult. I remember particularly being a very closeted gay man, where I felt like I was better than people. I felt like I needed to show up more than people. I was addicted to social media comments, and I also was still able to maintain good friendships, but it wasn't based on manipulation. It was based at times a bit on scarcity, where I was like, I just needed that supply and validation because I hadn't had that for a while too. And I was protecting my ego because I felt really fragile inside of myself. So, if you come from an experience where, for example, in my case, I had been bullied in childhood and I didn't really feel, like I was able to hold on to people in an effective way, love becomes control. You also feel like you need to seek out validation in order to feel good about yourself, especially if you've had a history of feeling good about yourself. And I remember when those walls came crashing down, I realized this just can't continue because, I feel numb. I felt emotionally dead inside of myself. I felt like I wasn't actually able to, it's not that I wasn't able to relate to people. I still had empathy. It was just more of the fact that I just felt like I wasn't able to process my own emotions. I was so stuck up here. So I want to say this is where I think the diagnosis can sometimes cause people to get stuck in their heads because they think, oh, well, hang on a minute, I've got those traits. Surely I'm a narcissist too, or I've exhibited those patterns of behavior before too. We all have to a degree, especially at points in our lives where times are difficult because at the end of the day, these patterns of behavior are actually rooted for us in order to survive at certain circumstances too. And it's only when they're maladaptive, where they're coming out in like really dominant ways, is when it can be problematic. And many people can be in partnership with people who have these traits where it is, you know, maybe a particular phase, depending on the person. And that's when the whole diagnosis becomes kind of, you know, confusing because they're like, are they or aren't they? And the fact of the matter is that even if that person's having a good day or a bad day, you know, at the end of the day, the diagnosis doesn't help. The point is, how do you feel about being on the receiving end of bad behavior?
Yeah, and being able to empower one's self to not continue to engage in a relationship that doesn't serve. So it's good to note that as well, because I think we can often conflate being narcissistic with being egotistical. And
Yes.
at a certain age, and your frontal lobe is fully developed till 25 years old, your critical thinking and rational thinking and ability to delay gratification doesn't really solidify until then. Of course, there's outliers. That's how we reach averages in research. However, that's pretty standard. And so we would shy away, at least the training that I received, we shy away from giving a personality disorder diagnosis until the mid 20s. Even if we see the traits beforehand and we're getting treatment or helping the person getting treatment with that prior to, oftentimes those symptoms do ameliorate with the proper treatment, proper time given for brain development. And then if it persists past that, then we would take a look. There's a whole other presentation I give my students when I teach this in classes. We don't have time to get into it on Instagram. Maybe another day I will. But there's something I wanted to read from my psychoanalytic training, as well as show the continuum of self, often referred to as the human magnet syndrome. So according to self-psychology, we all have narcissistic traits. It is how well they are integrated or not that can create the presentation of narcissism. According to Kohut, within the first 24 to 36 months of life, we need mirroring, twinning, or idealization in this years. And if it isn't given by our parents, then that can be problematic. And this is a quote from Kernberg, another psychoanalyst. Narcissism is the little libidinal investment of the self. Narcissism at that level is in contrast to an object libido, which is the investment in others. So at a clinical level, narcissism means the regulation of self-esteem. Normal narcissism, as we mentioned earlier, the non-pathological adaptive kind, is normal self-esteem regulation. However, pathological narcissism is pathological self-esteem regulation. So codependent tendencies, as well as being an empath, as people have called themselves or others, and narcissists are on opposite ends of the same spectrum. Both suffer from low self-esteem and utilize different skills to cope with it. There is a continuum of relational health that humans use to get to a baseline homeostasis. So I don't know if it'll show my laptop,
I'll
but
show.
see that if you're taking a look at the continuum of self, we have codependency on one side and pathological narcissism on the other. And if we are moving more towards zero, the neutral point, that would let us know that the person has an increase in their mental health and they're less geared towards a self-orientation and more geared towards a healthy integrated orientation to reach zero. So this is why one of the reasons I see, after I purport, I think, that this pairing happens very commonly, because everybody has narcissistic traits and everybody has self-esteem. It's to what level we have it. Do we have low self-esteem? Do we have high self-esteem? It makes sense then, if our traits are being expressed in such a way that we're trying to gain more self-esteem and we're trying to feel better about ourselves, it may come across that we are full of ourselves or very self-interested because of how we go about trying to reach that baseline homeostasis. And it does feel good to be around somebody who strokes our ego, who makes us feel good about ourselves. And coming at it from an analytic perspective, we're often modeling by doing, whether it's explicit or implicit, or we want others to give to us what we're really giving to them. And being able to communicate with yourself, like, where are my warning signs? Do I do these things? And the traits that I listed earlier many of us have had those at some points in our life, right? So just have that. Same thing with other diagnoses, right? Like the one-off bylines of these diagnostic criteria for anxiety or depression, right? Trouble sleeping, either sleeping too much or sleeping too little. Have you ever had that in your life? Because I know I have, right? It doesn't mean it's automatically whatever is underneath the diagnosis that it's listed under. So being more discerning and being more understanding that leaving the diagnosis to professionals. And if you are noticing these patterns of behaviors in another person, tasking yourself with delineating, do I stay or do I go? And if I am attracted to those traits, can I do something in myself to shift that attraction, to protect myself, to not be as vulnerable? And women, research shows women in their early 20s are the most susceptible to being attracted to people with the dark triad personality type, which are Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, because of the nature of, again, lack of frontal lobe development, which is the critical thinking piece, as well as what we get fed in media. They're tall, dark, and handsome, and sexy, and this, and edgy, and joie de vivre, and this like feeling of providing in life, and this excitement, and that's often going to pair together. So I think a good thing to note, or an important thing rather to note, is when you're looking and you're noticing that your energy feels really drained by being around the person, or that nothing is ever enough and they're going about getting things in a way that doesn't feel good to you, you don't stay around them. And it's also not your job to diagnose them. So I think it's very, very clear to delineate the actual clinical disorder and diagnosis must be by a professional with the actual person separately. And the presentation statistically will be lower because of many reporting, self-reporting, lack of treatment, but like there's going to be a lot of reasons why that number may not be accurate. And I don't personally or professionally want to get too caught up on what the actual specific thing is, because that doesn't justify having this be this like widespread national issue. And it's worth repeating that we can all have narcissistic traits. It's to what degree they're expressed and how aware we are of the impact they have on other people, that we can be mindful. There's nothing wrong with wanting admiration. But if you require excessive admiration all the time, constantly, and that's the only thing that you have on the list, that may be a time to look inward and work on some self-esteem and bolster your self-confidence and try and come from within and look at self-validation. So that's one note I have, and I'm going to pass it to you while I pull up my other notes.
No, thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
I completely agree with everything that you said, and I think there's a lot of value in what you've said too, because at the end of the day, I think breaking down like even that the delineation, and also that that spectrum where it's like +5 codependent, +5 pathological narcissism, you know, blends really well together. But even that can be overlapped with other frameworks too. For instance, people who struggle with alcoholism may also exhibit patterns of narcissism, because many of those people who go through those cycles do exhibit the same hot and cold, where it can be punishing one minute and very loving the next.
Oh, yeah.
Can exhibit the same sort of issues too, where for the people who are maybe more codependent, they still feel like saving the person from their, you know, their source of addiction. And again, I think that's a key thing for a lot of young women, where they've grown up, and at times men too, where they feel, you know, that they are able to try and fix someone, when in fact what they're doing is replaying a nasty scenario that they've experienced in childhood, thinking, oh, well, you know, I've experienced this. I know what this is like. I can fix and make this work. And they think that because their threshold for pain and abuse is higher than the average person, that they're not only being, you know, maybe brave, a savior, or, you know, being so good, dutiful even, that they can make it work. And it's just like, it doesn't work like that. You know, 1 + 1 = 2, and it's not suddenly going to equal 3. And it's just one of those unfortunate life lessons, which is just because, well, actually, no, because it couldn't work with your parents, it is also not going to work with other people. And we individually cannot change another person. And even with all the best therapy in the world, if you were to stay with someone who's going through these experiences and they're doing it for you, it is going to be a kicking and screaming match by the other person. Because really, at the end of the day, when someone goes to therapy on behalf of another person and not for themselves, it's kind of like a little child who's been naughty and wants to get their toy back after their toy's been taken. And so when they've done the thing, they'll come back to you being like, look, mummy, I've gone and done the thing. Can I have my toy back? And it's like, no, because you haven't shown that you've been able to change. And like I said, change takes a long, long time. So that's another thing too. In addition to that as well, if you are, I think if we break down like some of the traditional signs of narcissistic bonding or trauma bonding, you know, I think that the cycle, which has been cited many times, and I agree with this, is, you know, you have your love bombing, devalue, and discard phase, and yet those traits in and of themselves, like that pattern, can also exist for people who may have more avoidant patterns of behavior too. Typically, people in dating who are more avoidant will usually blow up people in the beginning because they're feeling quite lonely. They want to be vulnerable. They're overcompensating because they don't want to feel like they're not being needy. And then occasionally they'll ghost because they get to, you know, they reach their threshold for how much they can handle. And they're just like, I can't deal with this because I'm just so worried about losing my independence. I don't think I'm meant to be in a relationship. And even as you can see that, like, I'm not an avoidantly traded person, but like, I know what it feels like because it's that whole thing of like, I just don't want to be in this because it's just too much for me right now. So they get anxious about it too. They're not a narcissist. Even though it may feel like they're being narcissistic because they're not caring about your feelings, they got to care about themselves. Maybe that's their narcissism protecting themselves in that case. It's not about you, it's about them because they just can't handle it. They've got work to do. They're not actually a clinically diagnosed narcissist. But it's easy for people, I think, to be so offended by people's behavior that it becomes so much easier to just label people narcissistic when in fact, the behavior, I think, is what's more important, because if you like the behavior, oh, well, that's you know, its own thing. But if you don't like the behavior, as you said, should I stay or should I go? Or more like, can you accept this? Can you accept that this is the way it is? And we'll get into that piece in a minute too, because I think the radical acceptance piece is a massive part of this. Or, you know, do you go and go, this is just not for me. As you said, I'm feeling drained. I just don't feel like myself in this situation. I feel like I'm turning into a narcissistic person when I'm there, and most people will. Most people in these situations will genuinely feel like a piece of shit when they're in these environments, and they'll become someone that they're not. And that's not exclusive to relationships. Workplaces are very much like this too, where a lot of people in workplaces with narcissistic environments, you know, will start to take on, as you said, that countertransference of the personalities in the environment. And in fact, a lot of social environments are geared towards that narcissism at the moment too. It's not everywhere, but it's definitely a lot of places. And it just works for a lot of those individuals because they manage to make it work for them. And it doesn't mean that every single employee or employer is a narcissist. It just means that after you've been playing Monopoly for a long time, some people have just gotten very good at not only having a hand on the board, but also a hand in the bank.
And it's something to be said for, again, if it's somebody's best interest and they prioritize their best interests, that does not automatically mean it's a diagnosis. That is a way of being in the world. And so when we're looking at it from, again, a more clinical perspective, it's narcissism essentially, as the diagnosis, is I am the shit, and it's defending against low self-esteem of feeling like shit, or that I am shit. And you need to get into the ability to code and view shame and then actively regulate the shame, because often what I see in this presentation is the person on their stages of development in psychosocial development got stuck on autonomy versus shame and doubt at a very young age, and they got stuck feeling more shame and doubt rather than feeling more autonomous. And we have these erroneous expectations that people will be incapable of giving you what you want due to their own limitations. And you have to ask yourself, what expectations do you have of others? How defensively are you structured as yourself? And then this can also lead to secondary problems such as eating disorders or addictions, and also being overly reliant on external sources of self-esteem. And we don't have time, unfortunately, today to get into all of what usually happens in childhood to create this in existence. Maybe we can do another episode on that at another time, but there are a few other kinds that we look at. And this is from a research article that I'm reading it for those of you watching at home. It's on my laptop. I'm not staring off into the ethers. There is overt narcissism, this is typically what we can kind of consider the grandiose narcissistic, somebody who is very outgoing, arrogant, entitled, overbearing, an exaggerated self-image, needing to be praised and admired, exploitative, competitive, and lacking empathy. Some research connects overt narcissism with big five personality traits of extroversion and openness, and typically disagreeability. So they're agreeable trait, they're not as agreeable because they're more self-interested. So overt narcissism is usually, again, more common because it's overt. Covert narcissism is more of a vulnerable or closeted narcissism. It's the contrast to overt. Typically, it's not overbearing or loud. The covert does not fit that pattern. There's usually expressions of low self-esteem, higher likelihood of anxiety, depression, and shame, introversion, insecurity or low confidence, defensiveness, avoidance, tendency to feel or play the victim. And that's a post that I put on earlier today in Cartman's Drama Triangle and research. Some of these covert narcissism, people experience this will be very self-focused, and it's likely to conflict with the deep fear or sense of not being good enough. And it's found most strongly linked to the traits of high neuroticism, which is the tendency to experience unpleasant emotions, and disagreeableness. So they might have a hard time accepting criticism, but the lack of acceptance might be more covert, and they will internalize it and go inward negatively rather than lash out and try and make you feel like a bad person in response. And this article also lists antagonistic narcissism, which is a subtype of overt narcissism, leading with arrogance, a tendency to take advantage and manipulate others, compete with others, disagreeability, or prone to being argumentative. Research from 2017 shows facets of narcissism and forgiveness, and people with more antagonistic narcissism report they were less likely to forgive than people with others. One of the last ones is communal narcissism, becoming morally outraged, describing themselves as empathetic and generous, and they react strongly to when they see things as unfair. The difference between communal narcissism and genuine concern for the well-being of others is that social power and self-importance are major roles or motivators for what the behavior is that they're doing. And then the last one listed in this research study is malignant narcissism. It's a more severe form. It can also cause more problems for the person living with it. This is more closely connected to overt rather than covert. Somebody with this may have traits of common narcissism, like a need for praise and to be elevated above others. But in addition, they can also exhibit vindictiveness, sadism, also known as getting enjoyment from the pain of others, aggression when interacting with other people, paranoia or heightened worry about potential threats. Someone with this may also share traits with somebody who has antisocial personality disorder. They're also more likely to experience legal trouble or substance use disorder. So that is the last that I will read from my research that I pulled up for this episode to be thorough. That clearly there is a lot going on behind the scenes that we would take into account if we were looking at truly drawing a diagnosis. And if you are watching this either now or catching the replay, a lot of this, many of you are noticing a lot of this is extremely nuanced, and it would be extremely case by case. So instead of focusing on the other person is this, or the other person did this to me, or I can't do this because of whatever the reasoning is, my approach, we've talked about this before in other episodes, and you mentioned this, taking that empowered stance of, okay, and what do you get from being with somebody if they did fit any of those criteria? Does it fill a role for you? Does it increase your self-esteem to be needed to that level or appreciated to that level? Do you enjoy the chase of the high highs and the low lows of having somebody value you in a way that you've never been valued before, and unfortunately being discarded? Does this play out some childhood wound that hasn't been healed? There's so much nuance to it that I would definitely recommend people not be quick at all to label or to shame or put in a box, and instead take a look inward and outward. If indeed they are that, which is only up to a professional to discern, what are you going to do with the information, right? Even if they are, to what end, and what are you going to do with the information? And I think that is really the more productive question to ask. And yes, we all have narcissistic traits. to how well they are integrated and to what degree they are expressed is typically how much they impact our lives in a negative or a positive way.
100 billion%. And I mean, it's one of those things where I think it's important to understand, going back to some of the things that you were saying earlier, like, you know, I use this phrase very carefully. We all have a degree of what I call the ability to have healthy narcissism, meaning that we have the ability to be self-confident, but when it becomes maladaptive, that might be entitlement. We also have the ability to be, you know, able to pursue our goals and be ambitious. But when it's maladaptive, that can become a sense of superiority and grandiosity over the average person. We also have the ability to look after oneself. And when it becomes maladaptive, it becomes selfish to the point of not even caring how your actions impact those that, you know, are around you. And I think this is a really important point to make, especially in the realm of boundary setting. There are going to be times when we say things to people, it is, you know, not in our intention to hurt another person. And we are still going to say things when we need to get a point across that something's not working for us, and it may trigger someone. Recently, I had a situation where someone had actually tried stealing money from me, and I think the phrase that I used was, I feel like I have been stolen from, and I also feel cheated on too. And in that expression, I'm not saying that the person is a thief or a cheater. Their response, however, was really interesting. They said, I don't like the fact that you said you feel like you've been stolen from or cheated from, when in fact, that's pretty much what happened. And I'm illustrating this example because one could take this example and then go in the back of the head and look at all these other negative moments that they had with this individual and draw out a picture and go, oh, they're a narcissist. And it simply doesn't work like that. This individual, in this particular case, had a very unfortunate, you know, way of handling criticism. It does not mean because their inability to take on criticism that they are a narcissist. No. Sure, they've done something silly and they'll have to work on that eventually. And, you know, me perhaps moving away from that space is probably the best thing for them, because they'll reflect and go, how did I contribute to this? Yeah. Or they won't. But the point is that it's not up for me to decide what they do with that information. The fact of the matter is I have to protect myself. And in me saying that, you know, I could tell that they were hurt by what I'd said, but I'd said it in such a boundaried way where it was like, look, I've got to protect myself, and I'm sorry if, you know, with all due respect, if you can't handle the fact that I have emotions around this and I feel this way, which is, by the way, completely, you know, you can't debate my emotions. That's on you to deal with. So, you know, it's drawing that fine line between realizing that when we're having boundary setting and we're doing that, yeah, sometimes we're going to piss people off. We don't mean to hurt them. And sometimes we'll get better at learning how to fight, so that way we can, you know, navigate these waters better. But if you're dealing with someone who's so like low threshold for disagreements and stuff like that, again, it goes back to your question, which is, well, what's the reason you stay in this role? Like, what do you gain from trying to, you know, child someone and protect them from having to deal with the consequences of their actions?
Yeah, and to your point, you brought up a good point in describing that interaction that happened with that person that you had to share that with. Unfortunately, that they did, you know, they did those behaviors that were not very kind and definitely not going to grow a friendship. That when we share with other people what's going on for us, we can't automatically assume they're going to take it well. And that can be due to a multitude of factors. Were they ever modeled conflict growing up? Are they a tendency to get defensive because somebody else has brought this to their attention before, and they're in that middle ground spot of, I know something's wrong, but I don't know what it is, and other people have told me, and I'm not working on it yet. I'm not feeling it yet for whatever reason. Do I get defensive because I never was taught emotional regulation skills? Am I defensive because I have a deep fear of abandonment, or I have a deep fear of intimacy or closeness? And even though a lot of the professionals or people who talk about mental health and these concerns and, you know, growth edges, I guess, if you will, on social media, people are incredibly nuanced as individual human beings, and in their own actual day-to-day life that's off camera or off screen or off script, and being able to delineate, you know, what do we see versus what's really going on underneath, we won't really know. Right? We don't know what the behind the scenes are of that person receiving that information and why they're getting defensive. And anybody has more than every right to jump to conclusions and to draw conclusions without any factual evidence for it, if that is how you would like to live your life, that is 100% available to you as an option. It's
More power to you.
the one I would recommend. I think being curious while coming from a place of valuing and honoring oneself and protecting oneself, that leads to a more functional, happier, healthier life, because you aren't putting yourself or continuing, once someone has shown you mistreatment for whatever reason, that you are okay with that. And unfortunately, it can take some time for people to show who they truly are. Not everybody is going to present like this and how we've described today in the more pathological sense right away. You may not know it, or it may feel really uncomfortable, but also you like it because, again, it feeds into, wow, this person's really building up my self-esteem. They're giving me everything I never thought I could have. They're making me feel loved in ways I never thought possible. That is understandably a pleasurable experience mentally, or for your self-esteem or your inner child, or whatever way you want to look at it. There's something to be said for looking at it full picture. Is this healthiest for me long term? Can I still maintain my friendship and family relationships? We're talking about this is in a romantic sense. If this happens, unfortunately, to be a family member or what have you, you are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to protect yourself from that. And being mindful, everybody has their own choice. I really want to highlight that. Being mindful to not continue to interact with it as much as possible, even if it's only up here, and plaguing yourself by perseverating on this. You have two options, really. You expect the person to be like that every time you interact with them, or you, to the degree that you're able to, remove the contact or access from your life. And it's not to say like, oh, just that easy. I know that this is Instagram, this is nuance, this is not me waving a wand. I'm sharing that because sometimes that's the first time people have heard that they actually do have a choice in being able to advocate for themselves to be treated differently, or to remove themselves from a situation in which they are being treated poorly.
Agreed, fully agreed. And before I want to talk about radical acceptance, because I feel like that nicely ties into what you're talking about, I also want to just say, I love the way you were talking, like, look at the way in which you described the nuance of this, you know, even how you were describing like that, you know, that behavior and, you know, in relation to conflict. It's amazing because I think we could so easily get caught in our heads, you know, trying to put someone into a box. But the reality is that it is impossible to really ascertain a full person, you know, overnight. You may meet someone in the first handful of dates and get so overwhelmed by how amazing they appear and think that they're, you know, they're everything you ever wanted. And we get so fixated on the future of like how they could be, what they might be like. And it's like a childlike fantasy when in fact, we don't know that person. In fact, I even, you know, like obviously I've gotten to know you, Talia, a bit better, but like I would still say I still don't know you. Like it's a process of getting to know you. And I think this is an important thing I want to say to people, which is, you know, even though there's a lot of information out there better helping us to protect ourselves from these kinds of patterns of behavior, and yes, there are lots of personalities out there which are problematic for one reason or another, the fact of the matter is that, and this is something I really urge people to understand, is, you know, the way a person is probably far less important compared to how that person is treating you long term, because whatever image you have of that person, whether it be the image of who they were when you first met them versus who you'd like them to be, doesn't really matter. It's how that person interacts with you in the moment that ultimately matters, and what you intend to do about it, which, dovetailing into radical acceptance,
Sure.
this is a hard thing to get to. You know, as you said, like, do I stay or do I go, is like sort of the really glossy sort of summary for this too. You know, so many people online will say things like, the most self-loving thing you can do is to leave. And yeah, sure, within reason, I guess it is. It's pretty empowering.
There's a
It's a
lot
pretty empowering move.
what if you're dependent on the person, or they've cut you off from, and that's one note. And then I don't mean to interrupt, but this is going to leave my mind if I don't say it, that there's a large delineation between a diagnosis of any kind and a pattern of control and withholding in an abusive relationship. And it is true that somebody with the actual diagnosis of NPD is capable of perpetrating that. However, there are other reasons why that pattern occurs, and that does not automatically mean it's the person that has or that that person has that diagnosis, and to be in that radical acceptance state is difficult if you are caught up in a pattern where you actually can't leave. So I want to give the caveat, I'm not saying to just leave, because it's not that easy by any means. Human beings are incredibly nuanced and each situation is incredibly different. However, if you are in a position where you can radically accept who that person is and you are not forced to stay with them or tied to them, that's more the question of what would you, should you stay or should you go? That's
Correct.
Yeah.
And like, I love that you said that too, because that raises a whole bunch of things. But I suppose before we get into like that particular part of the journey, I think I want to phrase it like this. It is a massive journey in terms of like radically accepting like the person is exactly who they are. And I think it's about giving yourself the opportunity to be angry, disappointed, frustrated, and sad that they are not who you would like them to be, and for whatever reason that may be. And maybe that's by journaling about it, just getting angry and tearing down paper and writing letters to them, not literally to them, but just the act of writing a letter to them if they were, there with you. Because that really allows you to process a lot of that emotion that's preventing you from really making a decision on this stuff too. The second part then I think really would be, okay, I can accept that 2 + 2 = 4. This is who they are. And I'll give you a really good example of this too. And this person's definitely does not have NPD qualities. Sorry, they're not a diagnosed narcissist. They just have qualities which can be narcissistic. I remember I had a relative who had, it was difficult to be around, and they, exhibited some of the patterns. One in particular was anytime I came to them with anything emotional, they just couldn't hold space for me. It just became my fault. It became my responsibility to deal with it. And it felt like basically I was always to blame for something that was outside of my control. And so I had to radically accept that the fact was this person just couldn't love me the way that I needed to. So what could I do about it? And that's when I started exploring options. And in my case, I looked to just turn to my friends to get my emotional needs met, or, speak to a therapist about it, because that's the healthier outlet for me. And sure enough, over time, by, exploring what options that I had and not going to that individual for that particular thing, the relationship actually improved, because I was like, oh, you mean I can still maintain a functioning relationship with this person, but I have to accept the fact that I actually can't get that particular need met from them, but everything else is hunky-dory?
Yeah.
What a surprise. And even though they have some patterns of behavior which, are still not great, I don't care. Like, that's for them to figure out on their journey. That's for them. They're like, all of that behavior is not impacting me to the degree where I'm like, I need to go. But if it were, I think this is the other thing too. Should I stay or should I go? Well, for some people, they're in marriages where for them, they're just like, look, they're at a stage in life where I really don't feel like I can let them go, because that would make me feel terrible after the fact. That's using that sense of like, well, this just connects with my values. And, for whatever it may be, it's just for me. And it's like, more power to you. If that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. I personally couldn't do that, but if it's your journey, it's your journey. And then for other people too, where they're just like, I've had enough, I've got to go. Set that plan in motion and take your time with it. But this is the thing that I really want to urge everyone, especially those of you who are the well-intentioned friend or therapist or coach. Please, for the love of God, don't jump to the "you should leave them" card, because it's only going to create unnecessary resistance for that person and actually prevent them from making a really empowering decision for themselves. You think you're doing the right thing, you're actually not.
And that's why legally and ethically, as a therapist, at least I will speak in America, we are not allowed to give you direct advice or tell you exactly what to do. It's not in our ethical code. It's not by our license code. And I know psychologists and other mental health professionals with different letter labels are very similar. We are with you to help assist you based on evidence-based practices and skills and interventions that these are healthy traits of a relationship. These are potentially unhealthy traits of a relationship. These are skills to communicate. These are resources if you need housing, financial support, etc. There's more support and more education and being able to hold space again for what that process would be like, rather than saying, oh, well, there are this, you need to leave. That's not an option available to everyone. And let's say in a alternate reality it were, there's so much attachment and connection to what the person was, what they could have been, what they should have been, whatever void they were filling. There's so much nuance to it. It isn't always that easy, even if it were an option available to everyone. And that is not the role of a licensed mental health professional or a clinician to tell you what to do or not do. Our role is to be alongside you and provide you the resources, tools necessary, and skills and interventions necessary to assist you in making ultimately what you choose as the best decision for you.
Fully agreed. Fully agreed. And I think that on that note, like, I know even as a friend, if someone comes to me and, like, I had this situation recently, a mate of mine came up to me and said, oh, you know, I really didn't have a great time with my ex, but I'm thinking of going back to them because I really, you know, want to give it another chance. And they said they've changed, they've been to therapy. And even though they threw a glass at my face, I really feel like this is, you know, got a thing for me because I was so happy when I was with them. And even if I can, with the power of my experience, know, I'm like, this just sounds like a recipe for disaster. What I've said, particularly in that situation, was, I gotta be honest, personally, I wouldn't go back in your situation. However, I think this could actually be a really important step for you in your journey, because if you get the information you need about whether or not this is actually the right person for you, you know, the one as you're describing, or someone who's actually going to give you that, they're going to fill that hole in your void right now and they're going to make you feel good, more power to you, because only you will be able to determine for yourself whether or not this is the right thing for you too. And I want to be very clear before I share with you a bit of the outcome of this. You know, I am not encouraging domestic violence, and I'm certainly not enabling it by having that comment too. It's more about giving the person permission to essentially to fuck up, because in that case, they can hopefully learn from the situation, in which case this person did. They actually came back to me recently and said, I was thinking about it off the back of a conversation I had with my ex, and I just got so triggered and I just didn't want to even consider, you know, pursuing that option. But I'm glad I just, like, you know, considered it for a bit just to get more clarity for myself as to what I needed. And I think this is the problem. So many of us clinicians and even friends and family members want to save people because we don't want them to go through difficult experiences because of experiences that we've had. And that's actually doing a massive disservice. And maybe this is, again, a topic for another day, but, like, one of the things that can contribute to narcissism is actually what I call the inoculation of necessary stress. We need to go through adversity. We need to go through difficult times, and depriving people of those opportunities to build up those skills for themselves actually deprives them of getting the wisdom that we have as clinicians in this role to be like, personally, I wouldn't put myself through fire because I've been through enough and I know how to walk myself out of it. But hey, maybe you need to be in the fire just for a little bit to figure out how you can gain mastery over this in your way, which in essence is trauma healing in of itself, because it's about how you reconceptualize and conquer your own trauma.
Yeah, being able to have to make one's own decisions, whether they are self-labeled as a mistake or a choice. And I like to, when I work with clients and they're in a very deep shame spiral, when they're blaming themselves for making a mistake or a poor decision or however they choose to word it, it's really stopping the shame in its tracks by offering them, what if we started to relabel a mistake by their wording as a choice that you wouldn't make again, right? And I think people should make mistakes, and I'm no negative charge in that. People should or could or may benefit from making mistakes all the time, right? Oh, learn that, wouldn't do that again. Or a mistake could be a poor timing, or a mistake could be, had I known then what I know now, right? Like, there's so many different ways that people can choose to relabel that aren't negative and that aren't shame-based, that give somebody an opportunity for growth. So with that said, yes, we will definitely do more episodes. And in summary, for our topic of today, this was for an article I wrote recently for, I don't know if it's out yet, but it's for a different publication. One of the last lines that I wrote, which I will share here as our end note, when somebody has a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, there is a craving for validation and attention as if it is oxygen. Without it, the false self dies and the true self is too vulnerable, with too low of self-esteem at the core, feeling starved off and unable to function. So if you think of it from that perspective, I'm saying this is just off my notes, of false self and real self, if at the core is a low self-esteem coping mechanism, it's not a popular opinion, but looking at what possibly could that person have gone through for that to be how they move through the world, and for that to be the way that their personality structure is organized to move through the world. So I think I'm on a different end of the spectrum, obviously, not the human magnet system, but like the spectrum of like types of users on social media, etc. But really taking a look at it from a curiosity lens, not a blame lens, not a shame lens, not a defense lens. It's truly like, I am fascinated by what leads up to that, and other people are fascinated by it as well. Then we can often see some patterns or some signs, if you will, of certain early childhood experiences or certain or emerging adulthood experiences that may or may not lead somebody to have their personality be structured that way. And I word it that way very diligently because it is a structure. There's parts of ourself, we're made up of different parts, and they are organized in various ways, and they can be reorganized by way of mental health counseling and your own thought work. So I hope you all enjoyed our dynamic discussion delineating. I think we gave pretty thorough data and research, at least on my end. I came prepared today. I had notes. And if you're watching the replay, please go check out the previous post that I put up that also details Karpman drama triangle. And it has notes underneath very specific for that. And take it with a Himalayan grain of salt and go make good decisions.
And I would just end my piece off just say, be very mindful of the content you consume on narcissism on the internet. Yep. It's not a Bible. And also there are some people out there who put out a lot of great advice, and some of it, to be completely honest too, is over the top. Please go in with
discernment.
Yeah, thank you. Great word. Go in with discernment and realize that just because someone wants to talk to death about narcissistic personality disorder does not mean the world is chock full of diagnosable narcissists.
No, and even all the data I shared today, some of these research studies could be debunked in 5 years. Like, I am very open when it comes to this. I just do a lot of research and read a lot of stuff to be as prepared as I can be. And I'm willing to be wrong. And I'm willing to learn new information about, oh, that actually this study came out and we learned it's from this. Like, that's the benefit of learning and growing. So I'm super open to always learn more. And I think that's key with that piece of discernment is I'm discerning of the content I consume, and I'm open that at a certain point, new data could come along that better explains what the previous data did.
And we're not downplaying the risk of narcissism on relationship people.
Definitely not. You think, please go seek actual mental health counseling and get proper support if you are going through something like this. Social media would not be my primary recommendation for treatment.
No, fully agreed. But yeah, no, thank you very much for having me on again for episode 3, our joint series. It's been so much fun as always. And yeah, I look forward to the next opportunity that we get to have another conversation. Next time we'll probably be talking about, trauma responses and how everything we have is a trauma response.
Obviously. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And if you are watching this, you're catching the replay. If you have a very specific, kindly worded question, I'm happy to answer it. Do not argue in the comments because I will delete them. Because this is my
and we're not taking diagnoses either.
No, yeah, we're not doing that either. So thank you for watching. If you watched this far, and if you catch the replay, if you have a very specific question again, or you want research, or you want any of that, I'm happy to post links to the research studies that I referred to earlier and showed on my screen. So thank you, Ken. I appreciate your time.
Likewise, Talia. See you next time.
Bye.